What a treat today on The Question Is with Anthony Portantino. My guest is one of the smartest and most effective Congress members in Washington. From national security to preserving our hillsides and keeping things quiet from helicopter noise, I've got the person in the seat doing the right thing. So let's find out more. There's smart, and then there's wise. Congressman Adam Schiff is both, and I'm honored and thrilled to have him be my Congress member, and I'm even more proud to have him as my guest on The Question Is with Anthony Portantino. Find out about the NSA, strong leadership, plain old common sense from my friend, the great Congress member Adam Schiff. Thank you, Adam, for being here on The Question Is.
Anthony, it's great to be with you. With that kind of a build-up, I thought you were introducing some other guests. Like, you've got me on the show today. Who are you talking about?
Well, you know, it's true. I've had the pleasure of working with you for a long time. And, you remember the story, and I know you've talked to your children about the little engine that could. And you just keep doing good things, and you do it with such statesman-like tenor. And as you know, in Washington, there's a lot of gridlock and there's a lot of anger and frustration, but it never seems to affect you. How have you been able to stay Eve's husband all these years?
Well, that's more of a question for Eve. We just had our anniversary, actually. Well, thank you. I admire your work as well, and think you have adopted very much the same philosophy in the state legislature of keeping your focus on trying to get things done.
Right.
And it's tough at times with all of the partisan gridlock, but even in the worst of dysfunction, if you keep your eye on the things you can do and not the things you can't, there's still a lot you can accomplish.
Now, you were a prosecutor before you became a Congress member, and you sit on the House Intelligence Committee, and there's a lot going on in the world with the Crimea, the Ukraine, and you're at the center of that, both from an attorney but also from a Congress member. What do you see happening now, and where do you see us going?
Well, it's a really good question, and every day the situation in the Ukraine becomes more serious. There's a referendum that may take place this month, but it won't be much of a referendum because Crimea is occupied by Russian troops.
Right.
But it's something that Putin thinks will give the patina of respectability to what is really a military annexation. If he decides to go through with it, there's no way we can really stop that. But I think the key is we need to make sure that Putin and Russia pay a very high price for this, which means that in addition to helping the Ukraine, and we just passed legislation to provide some loan guarantees to Ukraine, we also have to impose very real sanctions on some of the people that are responsible for this annexation, on those that are violating human rights in Ukraine, as well as economic sanctions that affect their energy industry, trade sanctions. And this won't be easy to do, both because while we can make Russia pay a cost, it will cost us as well, but it will cost the Europeans even more. But it is, I think, vital to make sure that Putin understands, and others around the world, that they can't violate the territorial integrity of their neighbors with impunity.
That sounds something like out of the bygone era that we've been trying to stop in the world today. And we talk a lot about economic sanctions, and obviously the economy is important. The United States plays such a global role, both in the Crimea, both with Ukraine, the Middle East, everywhere. And I don't know if folks, sitting around their table understand just how important national security is to their well-being, and why the investment is necessary, and why we have to use that big stick when we need to.
Well, we are still a very indispensable player on the world stage.
Right.
And the reality is, when there is a vacuum, as we see in Eastern Europe, as we see as a result of the Arab Spring, there is a pretty indispensable role that we can play. It doesn't mean that we can control events. We can certainly try to influence them, and sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not. But there is no other nation that really can play the role we are right now. China's not going to be out there advocating for human rights around the world. Right. Russia certainly isn't. There aren't other countries that are capable, I think, of trying to bring the parties together in the Middle East to bring about a peace there. So much as the idea of American exceptionalism has gotten a bad name, the reality is there really isn't any other country that can step precisely into our shoes.
Right. And as you talked about, I mean, human rights violations are human rights violations. People dying in the streets are people dying in the streets, and somebody has to say this is unacceptable. And we've seen in times past when nobody played that role, genocides happen, bad things happen, and we've seen that around the world. So I'm glad you're in that seat and in that role, bringing sort of common sense in the picture. Where's NATO in all of this? I mean, how is, there's the diplomatic piece of it, there's the economic piece of it, and then there's the military piece. And obviously no one wants it to escalate to be a military operation, but how does I mean, just from a citizen, how does diplomacy and NATO work together in trying to keep the peace, whether it's in the Ukraine or other parts of the world? How does the diplomatic and the military piece work in concert or don't work in concert?
Well, they ideally work very closely in concert, and many of the countries that surround the Ukraine are members of NATO. Indeed, at times, Ukraine itself has been on a path to potential NATO membership. This is part of what has really concerned Putin because he feels militarily encircled by NATO. Right now, we are moving additional equipment into some of these NATO countries. We are doing air exercises and also beefing up our naval presence in the region. Not with the expectation that we're going to go to war. That's just not going to happen. But as a way of demonstrating that we have support for our NATO allies in the region, that there are outer limits to what Russia can do. It's very important to those countries to underscore our support for them. So there are military components that are working in tandem. One other aspect of it is we have a NATO-Russia working group, which I think is now being suspended, and rightly so. So some of the military cooperation that I think would be beneficial to Russia is not going to happen. It may cause us ultimately to revisit some of the things that we decided earlier that were unnecessary, like a missile defense system in Eastern Europe. So there will be a military dimension to this, but nobody wants or expects this to result in an East-West conflict.
What other countries are we working closely with? Where are our allies within our allies on this issue as it continues to percolate?
Well, probably the key partner in this is going to be many of our Western European allies, in the sense that we need them to work with us on sanctions. We can undertake some sanctions on our own. In fact, the President has already announced sanctions that go after individuals responsible for human rights violations in the Ukraine and for this territorial violation. But to have really biting sanctions, it needs to be done in concert with our allies. And there, Germany, France, Britain are going to be key partners. It is going to be tough for them. Europe gets a lot of their natural gas and other petroleum resources from Russia. They have a much bigger trading relationship, so it's a bigger ask, but by the same token, it's in their backyard. And at the same time that Western Europe is very important for the sanctions, Eastern Europe also, our allies in the Czech Republic and Poland and the Baltic states, these are very important allies as well.
And many of those countries have been touched by their own, sometimes on ethnic unrest and different divisions. So they've seen in their history how something like this that percolates can affect them for decades. So I would think they would have an incentive to want to make this work out to the benefit of the entire region.
Oh, absolutely. And, in Eastern Europe in particular, they have
Right.
too much experience living under the Soviet thumb
Right.
to want to live under Russian domination, and they're fiercely independent now. But we've seen in Georgia, where Russian troops still occupy a big part of Georgia, with Russian interference in Moldova, just how willing Russia is to interfere in what it considers its sphere of influence.
Right, military first, questions later. To me, one of the ironies is this is all unfolded during the Olympics, at a wonderful spirit of international, celebration in Russia, and to have this be on the doorstep of that and be coinciding at the same time, it almost seems surreal that it happened at that time.
It does, and I'm sure there are Kremlin conspiracy theorists that think that we made all these things happen in the Ukraine during the Olympics just to embarrass Putin. But the reality too is that Putin just spent $50 billion on a PR exercise with the Olympics
Right.
that has been completely undercut now.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, their world image, and certainly it just seems to me to harken back to another time that we should be beyond in this day and age and not facing these issues.
It really does. I mean, the idea that you concoct a referendum while you're occupying a territory of a foreign country, with the phony justification that you're protecting the ethnic minority, is such a old school page out of the historic playbook.
Right.
It really is quite astounding. But considering that Putin comes out of the KGB,
Right.
comes out of that era, it shouldn't be all that surprising.
Now, this is a terrible segue, but obviously national security is something that's important to our country. And you've been on the front lines of drafting legislation to protect the integrity of our telephones and protecting Americans as we wrestle with this whole issue internally. Tell us about the legislation you've crafted in Congress that you're proud of.
Well, you mentioned earlier that I'd come out of a background as a prosecutor. One of the areas that is very challenging right now in the national security environment is where do we draw the line between privacy
Right.
and national security, and that issue is, I think, more implicated in the area of this bulk metadata, this bulk telephone metadata program than probably any other intelligence
Right.
issue at the moment. And basically, what I would share with your viewers, because there's a lot of confusion about just what this data is and what is this program. Some people are under the impression that the NSA is listening to everybody's phone calls.
And that's not the case.
It isn't. And in fact, the bulk data that they collect is phone numbers and in touch with other phone numbers. It's the time of the call, the duration of the call, but it's none of the contents of the call. So there are no recordings in the bulk metadata. There's also no subscriber information. So while the numbers are in this drum of data, they're not connected with people's names.
Well, that's good for me, because I don't want them to listen in on my conversations with my 22-year-old when I'm trying to get her to talk to me and I'm only getting one-word answers. It's
Well, I can relate to that with my own two kids. But nonetheless, even though it's not conversations, it still implicates very real privacy interests, because that data in the wrong hands could be mapped. It could tell you a lot about, who's calling whom at what hour of the day and for what reason. And so it's worthy of making sure it's protected. And frankly, I don't think we should be gathering this data unless there's no other way, and there is a better way. So the bill that I introduced would essentially end the bulk collection, and it would have us go to the telephone companies with a particular number that we believe is connected to a terrorist plot, and then we can subpoena the information and say, okay, give us the number that this number has been in contact with, so that after a Boston Marathon bombing, we can find out, are there other co-conspirators? But we would use more of the model that we use, frankly, in the law enforcement context, where we don't ask for all of the data and then comb through it. We ask for only the data connected to the number we're concerned with.
right, probable cause, pertinent relationships, and use the criminal justice system to narrow the focus. I assume you're getting bipartisan support?
There is strong bipartisan support for ending the bulk metadata program, but it's very controversial. There's also some strong bipartisan support for the program. It doesn't cut down along very neat party lines, which in one respect is encouraging, because it shouldn't be a partisan issue.
Or it shouldn't be.
I think at the end of the day the program is going away. It will be restructured or disappear altogether, because it sunsets next year. And if we can't come to agreement, it'll completely go away.
Right. And if you think about it, I mean, in the news you see there's a lot of concern both on consumers with supermarkets and the whole credit card information. I mean, we as a nation need to set some standards that both the government follows and private industry follows, because as we become more and more electronic dependent, these issues are going to continue to dominate the discussion. I mean, we've become a cell phone society where people think about these things. So I'm glad that you're party to that conversation and leadership.
Well, and that's exactly right. These cameras that give you speeding tickets, they create a database of where people's cars are, when they are. So these issues are not going away.
They're not going away. We'll be back on The Question Is to continue our conversation with Congressman Adam Schiff. We've touched a lot of international affairs and national security. We're going to get down to some local issues and talk about his path to Congress when we get back on The Question Is with Anthony Portantino.
Who needs this modern world? I can live just fine out here without the road rage and boy bands. Of course, I might miss my Charter HD with football on ESPN and Walking Dead on AMC. ESPN and AMC. And, well, Shark Week on Discovery HD. But that's all. AMC, ESPN, Discovery, TBS, and Comedy Central HD. But that's it. Except for HBO HD.
Charter now has over 100 HD channels and more brilliant HD shows on demand than ever.
We're back on The Question Is with Congressmember Adam Schiff. Congressman Schiff, back when he was in the state Senate, was a leader in preserving our precious open spaces, and he's continued to do that in Washington. You successfully navigated, starting with the Bush administration, some very, very important open space legislation, the Rim of the Valley Corridor study, which affects both LA County, San Bernardino County, the entire foothills, both front and back. You've put that through a bipartisan tough effort. So tell us how that effort's going and what's going to be in the future.
Well, back, I guess now about 10 years ago when we introduced this bill, we had a very persuasive witness come back to Congress named Anthony Portantino, a very young man.
Left that out.
Did a great job helping persuade our National Resources Committee to pass the bill.
So can I have that on the record that it was my testimony?
Absolutely,
right,
without a question.
On The Question Is.
And essentially what that bill did was require a study of the open space in our region.
Right.
That goes all the way from the Santa Susanas to the San Gabriels, includes the Verdugos and what's called the Rim of the Valley, and determine whether portions of that ought to be made into a park, either an expanded Santa Monica Mountains recreation area or a new recreation area. That bill ultimately passed. That study's been ongoing for a number of years. That study will conclude this year, and the Park Service and Department of Interior will make a recommendation to Congress. Okay, this is how we think we can best preserve these resources, either by expanding the park, creating a new park, or whatever.
Right.
We have been encouraging public comment and
been holding a lot of town hall meetings and getting a lot of input.
We've had about 5,000 people write in support of an expanded recreation area. So we're awaiting the draft recommendation, and there'll be another public comment period on that draft. It's very important for the public to weigh in. This is a kind of a once-in-a-generation opportunity to preserve and expand the parks, because once they're gone, they're gone.
Right.
And back in the 1970s, when the Santa Monica Mountains Recreation Area was created, the Congress had the foresight to know that LA was going to continue growing, and if they didn't take steps to prevent the urban sprawl from taking over all the hillsides, they would be gone. I love the fact that we've got mountain lions that come into the Verdugos and into Griffith Park, that we've got bears eating meatballs out of garages in the Crescenta Valley.
Coyotes in front of my house.
Coyotes in front of your house, and cats in the back very scared.
Exactly.
And we want to keep those wildlife corridors and access to nature for all Los Angelinos.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, because again, you hit the nail on the head. As LA encroaches, you have to have a plan, because if you just leave it up to happenstance, you lose certain valuable pieces of the environment, you lose recreational opportunities, and in California, a lot of recreational opportunities are expensive. You go to an amusement park and that costs a family a lot. You go on a hike and it doesn't. You go fishing and it doesn't. And so we really do need to make sure that those opportunities are there for the next generations. And when you were in Sacramento, when you were the state senator, you saw how the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy's influence was expanding eastward as the San Gabriel Valley was becoming more and more prominent in these issues. And you wrote legislation at that time to expand the governance of the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy to include the eastern cities. So I see what you're doing nationally. It's sort of an extension of what you've been doing your whole legislative career in keeping that conversation and that expansion going forward.
Well, that's exactly right. That's certainly what I'm trying to do. And in a way, I wish the Conservancy and the recreation area had a different name rather than Santa Monica, because people think, well, that's the west side, and why do we want to be part of the west side? And we want something that's more of our own region. The reality is that the most important thing is to protect these resources under whatever name we use.
Not what they're called.
Not what they're called. And I appreciate your great work with the Conservancy and making that happen and adding to the public lands in our area. We have another great opportunity to do that, and bear in mind we're talking about one of the most park-poor parts of the country in LA, through the LA River. There's some very exciting efforts now to restore the LA River, and similar to the Rim of the Valley study, we're urging people to weigh in with the Army Corps of Engineers and support Alternative 20, which is the most expansive, the most visionary of the plans to restore the LA River. My son and I had a chance to kayak through the river over the summer, and
I've seen the pictures.
It was fantastic. We want more people to have that access to nature.
But I think you hit the nail on the head. Just as people focus on the name of the study, there's a lot of people that don't even realize that there really is an LA River. And the reason why they don't realize it is because 30, 40, 50 years ago, we didn't take the steps that we're taking now to make sure it was preserved and make sure it was enhanced. So, you know, it's certainly good that we're doing it, and I think you're right. We do need to get behind Alternative 20, which, if I'm not mistaken, also has some bike paths that connect all the way into the Verdugos that we're talking about as well. That whole plan is both local and regional in its approach.
Well, and you're absolutely right. The LA River, you know, was kind of a national joke because it was this concrete channel, and what was more symbolic of LA than a river made out of concrete? But now LA has an opportunity to show the rest of the country that even in the midst of you know, a densely built up urban area, you can restore wildlife. And so I'm very excited about the possibility.
You should.
Absolutely.
You should do that. No, it is exciting, and multi-agencies, and I think that's the role that I see you play so effectively, is you're the one that sort of navigates the local, the state, and the federal, trying to bring people together. And I think the frustration on the Rim of the Valley is because the eastern part is looking at the name and looking at the influences, and so I admire you. Even when you're holding the town hall meetings, it's not you saying, here's how I see it. It's educational in nature, and then trying to get the feedback from the community so the federal government can do the right thing, and that's a very laudable place to be. And I know it puts you sometimes in rooms with folks who may not be sharing the same let's have it all work out perspective, but putting one side over another. So,
well, you know, anything I think big and worth doing is going to run into its share of opposition.
Right.
In the case of the Rim of the Valley, there are some, you know, quite ardent anti-Park Service folks that don't like the Park Service now. They don't want to see the Park Service expanded.
Right. Afraid of eminent domain. I mean, people use that.
Oh yes, absolutely. Even though there's
none of it in there,
domain in this proposal. You know, there are other, I think, very legitimate issues about, you know, let's say we can all agree on expanding the parks in this area. Should they be independent parks? Should they be subunits of the Santa Monica recreation area? I'm agnostic on those issues.
Right.
I just want to protect the resources in the best way we can. I do want to acknowledge one of the great leaders, one of my colleagues, Lucille Roybal Allard, on the LA River.
Right.
She has been just a tremendous champion since day one.
Right. Well, again, as I tell everybody, when you start something in the south, it affects the north. When you start something in the east, it affects lots of folks look at things just in a small circle, but rivers flow, mountains sprawl, and you know, we all share it, whether it's on one side or the other, a common interest. Changing a little bit, you've been very active in the whole helicopter noise situation, and obviously that goes to a different set of quality of life. People who want to be in their bed at night and not be woken up by loud helicopter noise countywide. You've spearheaded the efforts to bring some common sense into that issue. How has that been going?
Well, it's been a struggle. The FAA is used to
doing
frankly,
what they want.
Well, certainly doing what they want, but they're used to focusing on the industry in the air and not the quality of life on the ground. And you know, Los Angelinos over the last 10 or 20 years have seen just an exponential increase in the amount of helicopter noise they have to put up with. Now, some of it, you know, is quite legitimate and quite irreplaceable. We're not going to stop police in high-speed chases or emergency helicopters responding to fires. Some of it, though, is really quite unnecessary. It's helicopters that are hovering low for paparazzi photographs, or tour operators that aren't really considerate of people on the ground and fly at much lower altitudes than necessary or hover for long periods of time. And you know, we ought to be able to develop some common sense rules of flight paths that minimize the imposition on neighborhoods. And I think one of the most critical things is to try to develop a comprehensive complaint system so that we know who is unnecessarily part of the problem.
Right.
Because whenever there's a problem, when there are helicopters that are buzzing houses or buzzing the concerts at the Hollywood Bowl, everybody points the finger at someone else. So, well, that must have been a police helicopter, and the police say, no, that was paparazzi, and the paparazzi say, no, that was the tour operator.
So having a system in place that actually figures out who's doing what, where, and when will sort of give you a roadmap to how to solve the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, one issue that I obviously want to cover before our time is up, I don't want to use the word small issue, but it's an issue that affects families in California who lost loved ones on the Frank E. Evans. And I know you have been probably the single biggest leader in Washington to help the families cope. I mean, these were Viet Nam veterans who died just slightly outside the military zone, and so they're not given the same reverence as those folks who were fighting for our country, died for our country, but happened a mile away. And I know you've met with the Secretary of the Navy. You've been a proud advocate of trying to get those who lost their lives on the Frank E. Evans the proper respect. And so I want to thank you for that, but also if you could tell us what you've done and how you've been working with the families. I know they talk about it all the time, so I wanted to make sure you got the right props for doing that, and then let us know what's been going on.
And I really appreciate all your advocacy on behalf of the families of the Frank E. Evans. And you're exactly right. This was a ship that was cut down in a military exercise after doing artillery support in Viet Nam. It was outside of that artificial line in the water, the combat line, and the consequence of that is that although 74 sailors lost their lives, they're not memorialized on the Vietnam Memorial Wall. And it would mean a lot to those families if they could be able to go to that wall and see their loved ones' names there and have a place to mourn and to join with other families.
Heal.
Heal. So I have weighed in now. I'm on my third secretary.
I know.
We do have the support, and I'm very proud of this. We have the support of the Secretary of Navy. But we couldn't get Secretary Gates' support. It's ultimately a call the Defense Secretary makes. We couldn't get Secretary Panetta's support. I met with him also.
I know you did.
And I just met with Secretary Hagel and made the case for this. And I'm hopeful because this is the first Vietnam veteran who's been our Defense Secretary. He told me that he was very involved in the establishment of the memorial to begin with, and he told me that he would give it his very personal attention. So, we're going to stay at it. The families deserve no less.
Right, and there were families that lost more than one sibling on that. I mean, it was before we changed the rules on how many, brothers could be in the same on the same ship. But I know the families really appreciate your efforts. One of the things, again, I'm a constituent of yours that I find refreshing and optimistic in this whole world of public policy is that you actually get to know the family members. You're not just somebody who's doing something because you got 7 emails. You've actually met with the victims' families and you've been interacting, and whether it's on the Frank E. Evans or the Rim of the Valley corridor or just picking up the phone and talking to constituents, I think you set the gold standard for working in public service. And so as a constituent, I thank you for that. As a talk show host, we've covered some pretty good topics here today. And anything that left that you want to touch upon? We've got about 30 seconds left. Anything?
Well, I right back at you is all I would say. Among other things, this job and the state legislature, require you to really enjoy working with people.
Right.
And it's a lot of long hours, and I think the only one who may work harder than I do is you.
I don't know
so I take my hat off to you, sir, and it's just a pleasure working with you.
Well, thank you very much for being on the show. We wish you well. I hope you continue to be my Congress member, maybe someday my governor, or who knows what, Attorney General of this country, because I think you make a difference. Thank you for joining us on The Question Is with Anthony Portantino. We'll see you again next month.